On the night of June 25, 1906, when a gunshot echoed through the rooftop garden of Manhattan's most prestigious entertainment venue, Madison Square Garden, one of the greatest scandals in United States history had begun. Harry Kendall Thaw, heir to one of Pittsburgh's wealthiest families, that night not only killed a man, but also brought to light the darkest secrets of New York's high society. So why did this wealthy heir cold-bloodedly shoot the famous architect Stanford White in front of the public?
My name is Harry Kendall Thaw, and the story I'm about to tell you is perhaps the bloody conclusion of one of the most complex love triangles in United States history. When I remember that hot summer night of 1906, I can still feel my hands trembling. But this trembling wasn't from fear, it was from anger. As someone born and raised in Pittsburgh, I had learned the power of money at a very early age. My father, William Thaw, had made millions on the Pennsylvania Railroad, then invested in the coal and steel industries, making our family one of the wealthiest families in the United States. Our mansion called Lyndhurst had 30 rooms, magnificent gardens, and dozens of servants. I was also a young heir who enjoyed this wealth, educated at Princeton, but money couldn't buy everything, especially not the past. I had a nervous temperament since childhood. My anger fits, my sudden outbursts. My family thought these were the tantrums of rich children, but I felt a deeper darkness within myself. This darkness peaked when I met Stanford White. The beginning of that night seemed ordinary. I had gone to the musical at Madison Square Garden with my wife Evelyn Nesbit. Evelyn, she was one of the most beautiful women of the era. Her auburn hair sparkled copper in the sunlight. Her innocent green eyes seemed to reflect the depths of the ocean. Her neck was graceful like a swan, her skin white as porcelain. With that delicate body, she had enchanted all of New York. When I first saw her take the stage, it was as if time had stopped. She had started as a chorus girl, then later became a model for the era's most famous photographers. Artists like James Carroll, Beckwith, and Gertrude Cassibier had immortalized her. She was one of Broadway's shining stars, and when I first saw her, I felt how madly my heart was beating. When I first saw her in 1903, it was as if time had stopped. That laugh, it was as if angels were singing. But there was Stanford White in Evelyn's past. Stanford White. Even pronouncing this name made my stomach turn. This 52-year-old architect was the designer of New York's most famous buildings. Madison Square Garden, Washington Arch, countless palaces and mansions. They had all come from his hands. He was perhaps a genius who shaped the city's architectural landscape, but he was also a pervert who preyed on young girls. Evelyn had met him when she was only 16 years old. When she told me about those days, I could hear the pain in her voice. Her voice trembled, her eyes misted over. White had invited her to his studio on West 24th Street in Manhattan, supposedly for portrait work. That studio. God, that studio was a real den of devils. Red velvet curtains, oriental rugs, bronze sculptures, and dozens of photographs of young girls hanging on the walls. And of course, that famous red velvet swing. White had offered young Evelyn champagne, and the rest is as you can imagine. When I learned that White had drugged her unconscious and then abused her, my hands had clenched into fists. Evelyn had lost her innocence on that red velvet swing. White's swing in the studio had become a plaything for the city's wealthiest men. Evelyn told me how White had manipulated her. He gave her expensive gifts, took her to the best restaurants. He said, "I'll make you a star." The poor girl, 16 years old, coming from a poor family, was looking for a chance on Broadway. It had been easy for her to fall into White's trap. But the worst part was that White hadn't been satisfied with just Evelyn. He had done the same things to dozens of young girls. The parties he organized in his studio were talked about throughout the city, but no one dared to touch him, because he was Stanford White. He was the famous architect. He had created New York's landmarks. When I married Evelyn, I thought we could leave this dark page of her past behind. We had married in 1905 at the Third Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh. Evelyn looked like an angel that day, her white laced wedding dress, the pearl tiara on her head. It was as if the whole world had fallen in love with her. We had spent our honeymoon in Europe, Paris, Rome, Vienna. Walking with her in every city, I felt proud. But when we returned to New York, White kept appearing in our lives. At every restaurant we went to, every social event we attended, every opera night, he was there. When we dined at Delmonico's, he sat at the corner table. When we watched La Traviata at the Metropolitan Opera, he stood in the opposite box. With that confident smile, those insolent looks, he looked at my wife as if he still owned her. The worst part was how Evelyn was affected by his presence. When White was nearby, she became tense. Her hands trembled. She couldn't eat. Once, when we were walking in Central Park, we saw White from a distance. Evelyn suddenly clung to my arm and whispered, "Let's go home, Harry." The fear in her eyes was driving me crazy and breaking my heart at the same time. White controlled not only our lives, but the entire city's social order. At the Colony Club, at the Union Club, even at Sherry's restaurant, where we frequently went, his influence was there. Waiters showed him special attention, reserved the best tables for him. The daughters of the city's elite families revolved around him like moths, and I just watched, struggling with the anger growing inside me. On the night of June 25, 1906, we had gone up to the rooftop garden of Madison Square Garden to escape the summer heat. Ironically, we were on top of the building White himself had designed. The rooftop garden was like a real paradise in the heart of New York. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light. Silver candelabras flickered on white-covered tables. The orchestra's charming melodies mixed with the summer night. Waiters moving around with champagne glasses seemed to be performing ballet. The women had worn their most beautiful evening gowns. Diamond necklaces sparkled. Everything looked perfect, but I knew this was deception. Mam'selle Champagne musical was being performed that night. As the dancers spun under the stage lights, their costumes were dazzling. While sitting at our table with Evelyn, I was constantly looking for White. My heart was beating wildly, but I was trying to appear calm from the outside. Evelyn was especially beautiful that night. Her blue velvet dress, pearl necklace, and those soft hair. But there was restlessness in her eyes. She too sensed that White was nearby, constantly looking around. When I held her hand, I noticed how cold her fingers were. At 9 o'clock, I saw him. Stanford White was sitting at a table close to the stage with his friend Thomas Clark. His white hair slicked back with pomade, his thick mustache carefully trimmed, and that ever-confident posture. He was smoking an expensive Havana cigar, sipping Dom Perignon champagne. His tuxedo was perfect. His collar pin sparkled under the crystal lights. When I saw him looking at my wife, my blood rushed to my brain. That look. He was looking as if he still owned her, as if he could take her whenever he wanted. Thomas Clark had been White's friend for many years. The two had been involved in countless scandals together. Clark was as immoral as White, but more secretive. That night the two were laughing together, joking, acting as if they were the most innocent people in the world. But I knew the truth. These two men were the nightmare of New York's young girls. A champagne bucket stood on White's table. Waiters constantly filled their glasses, changed their plates. People at other tables around looked at him with respect, sometimes coming to his table to chat. New York's most respected architect, the man who shaped Manhattan's silhouette. But I saw him differently. I knew his true face. I felt Evelyn tense beside me. I noticed her breathing change, her hands tremble. She had seen him too. She leaned toward me and whispered in my ear, "Harry, please, let's go. I don't want to be here." But it was too late. I put my hand on hers, but I couldn't stop the storm inside me. This man having touched my wife, having used her, having harmed her, the anger I had been accumulating for years, was now ready to explode. I couldn't bear it anymore. I stood up. I could feel the pistol in my jacket. It was a Colt .38, and I had been carrying it with me for months, for just such a moment. I saw the fear in Evelyn's eyes, but it was too late. The time for justice had come. As I walked toward White's table, everyone in the rooftop garden continued listening to the music. As I walked toward the stage, I felt like I was in a dream. The wooden floor under my feet, the lights reflecting from the crystal chandeliers, the orchestra's notes. Everything was happening in slow motion. White hadn't seen me, or hadn't wanted to see me. He and Thomas Clark were drinking champagne, having a pleasant conversation. When I heard White's laughter, the anger inside me reached its peak. How could this man be so comfortable? How could he so easily ruin my wife's life? When I reached right behind his table, I stopped. White finally felt my presence and turned around. When our eyes met, I saw that he too understood what was going to happen. But it was too late. When I pulled out the pistol, everyone around me froze. White tried to get up and run, but he was at close range. I fired the first bullet into his head. The man immediately fell to the ground. But it wasn't over yet. I fired the second bullet, then the third. Stanford White lay in a pool of blood on the roof of the building he himself had designed. The orchestra music had stopped. Everyone in the rooftop garden was screaming, seeking shelter behind tables. But I remained calm. I put the pistol on the table and raised my hands. Justice had been served. When the police came, I surrendered myself. I only told them this. He ruined my wife. I ruined him. When Evelyn ran to me, I'll never forget the expression in her eyes. Fear, shock, gratitude, and pain, all together. When I hugged her, I felt that we were finally free. In the following days, the newspapers went crazy. We made headlines with crime of the century titles. Evelyn's story, White's perversions, my anger. Everything was discussed for days. New York's high society was divided into two camps. Some saw me as a hero, some as a murderer. During the trials, we had to tell what Evelyn had experienced. The events on that red velvet swing, what White had done to young girls, his moral corruption. Everything was discussed in the courtroom. The United States had never witnessed such a scandal before. In the first trial, the jury couldn't reach a decision. In the second trial, I was acquitted on grounds of temporary insanity. But of course, I was committed to Mashuan State Hospital. Years passed. Evelyn and I grew apart. We divorced. White's family sued me. The media never forgot me. They were constantly after me. But I never regretted it. I still believe that what I did that night was right. Stanford White may have been a genius, but at the same time, he was a pervert who abused innocent girls. He had ruined Evelyn's life. There was no other way to stop him. The law couldn't punish him, so I punished him. The blood that flowed on the roof of Madison Square Garden wasn't just the blood of a murder. That blood was the blood of the hypocrisy of New York's high society, the domination of powerful men over weak women, and the existence of private justice when official justice fell short.
This horrific act by Harry Thaw brought to light the problems that lay deep within United States society in the early 1900s. Issues such as media frenzy, the privileges of the wealthy, and the vulnerability of women were discussed openly for the first time. This case laid the foundations of modern America's scandal culture and remains an example that is still talked about even centuries later. Some see Thaw as a hero fighting against injustice, some as a cold-blooded murderer. So who do you think was right in this complex story?